but we didn't get like recognized for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
See, I don't even know, and I work here,
I was nervous that someone was going to ask like a follow-up question to who do you guys play or anything like that. And I'm like, I don't know. I just know we were close.
You're safe. You're safe for me.
Yeah.
If you're all just dialing in, I want to welcome you to our Encore Learning webinar, LGBTQ and you, plus and you, creating an inclusive community. This was one of the highlighted sessions at CampusConnex in Orlando last month, and we're rebroadcasting it to be able to share some of the great content from the event. This session was one of 16 breakout sessions that focus on making great communities for off-campus student in the off-campus student housing market. We have an amazing lineup of speakers today who will share some of their insights about inclusion and what that looks like in the world today. If you weren't lucky enough to have attended the conference or missed some of the sessions, you can still have the chance to dive into some great shared content here. NA's sister organization, the National Apartment Association Education Institute, otherwise known as NAAEI, is proud to present Rewind, a collection of 16 PowerPoint-synced audio and video recorded sessions from CampusConnex. Purchasing this powerful online learning tool allows you to have ongoing access to some of the very best education and training content in the industry. You can share that content with your colleagues via training sessions and brown bag lunches, and you can also use it to earn TECs towards your NAAEI designation renewal. I believe the purchase price is $149 for all 16 sessions, and it's a really great investment in your professional development. And last but not least, before we get rolling today, I'm going to invite you to please mark your 2019 calendars for CampusConnex, slated for February 12th and 13th, 2019. We're going back to Orlando. We're looking forward to returning there in the winter months and enjoying a warm winter destination in a resort setting. Okay, all my commercials are done. Now we can turn our sights towards today's presentation. I'd like to introduce an awesome panel of experts for you. Cody Frank has recently made Orlando home in their position as the LGBTQ+ Services Coordinator at the University of Central Florida. In their role, they support the LGBTQ+ community through programming and inclusivity training, providing campus and community resources, and developing partnerships on campus and in the greater Orlando community. Next up, we have Mac Kaplowitz. He is a resident assistant at the University of Central Florida and a senior studying interdisciplinary studies with focuses in hospitality, behavioral science, and leadership. He's passionate about LGBTQ+ diversity and inclusion on campus. Mac has been a resident assistant for 2 years. Elijah Measle is an assignments coordinator for University of Florida Department of Housing and Residence Life. His specialties are in data management and LGBTQ advocacy. Elijah currently shapes and enacts trans-inclusive housing policies for the assignments team and contributes to developmental policies at the Social Justice and Gender Inclusion Housing Committee member. Last but not least is Emily Barber. She's the Director of Training for Landmark Properties. Emily has held various positions both on-site and at the corporate level during her 10 years with the company. She served most recently on the CampusConnex Education Advisory Board. She is also currently pursuing her master's degree in education from UGA in leadership, learning, and organizational development. Welcome to our panelists today. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Emily, I'm going to turn things over to you. So I'm going to pass the remote control your way. And Emily will take things from here. She'll be moderating our panel.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much, Clark, for having us and putting this together. We're really excited to be able to do this session again and kind of share it with a larger group. So I wanted to go ahead and get started. I'm not sure if it's just being slow or if the slide isn't transitioning, but we'll see.
Try using your arrow keys on your computer.
Sorry, of course.
That's okay. Here, I'll advance one.
Okay, and then maybe that'll get it going. So the first things that we kind of wanted to start off with is just the purpose of this webinar, and that is to try and open a dialogue about a topic that tends to be uncomfortable from people, and usually that stems from just not having enough information or not having enough knowledge. Usually the lack of knowledge leads to discomfort and avoidance, because it's just kind of easier to do that. So we wanted to start with some just general kind of facts for people before we start the conversation, so that if certain things are referenced, you'll kind of have a little bit of a base understanding. The LGBTQ plus community is growing, and that's something that, I think most everybody is aware of that, but here are some stats for you. So from the GLAAD did a survey, and the LGBTQ community represents about 12% of the population. And the majority of that is made up of people who are under the age of 34. There was also another survey done for high school kids, and they represent about 11.2% identified as either gay or lesbian, bisexual, or they weren't sure about their sexual orientation. One thing that was also interesting with that is that number actually more than doubled when you focused it on urban schools or urban areas. So clearly the population is growing year after year after year, and it might not be that it's growing, but people are being more comfortable with answering the question or identifying themselves in such a way that this is hugely important, just to the world in general, but also for all of us that are focused on student housing, because this is going to be the group of people that are going to have this larger population and are going to represent a larger demographic for our students, whether you're working on the on campus, as our panelists are, or if you're like me who works in off-campus student housing or just housing in general. It's definitely something that we're starting to try to take more of an approach on and try to provide more education so that it can be more of a topic that people are comfortable with discussing. So try to switch slides again. There we go. So the biggest thing, like I said before, is the challenge that we face is people are uncomfortable talking about this because either they don't have enough information, so they fear that they're going to say something wrong, or it has, there's too much stigma attached to it, so they don't want to ruffle people's feathers or get into debates or whatnot. But it's something that is super important to, just as a conscious citizen, to be knowledgeable about, but then also in our industry and our positions, we owe it to our students and our residents to be able to provide them with additional resources and experienced and knowledgeable staff to give them that inclusive community is what we're kind of talking about. So like I said, we wanted to kind of give you guys a base reference of information. I'm not going to read all of these definitions, but they, here are just some like terminology for you. So here are definitions of different terms that you might be aware of or might not be aware of. This call is being recorded, so I do encourage you to go back and read the definitions and educate yourself on this terminology. So one that we're probably going to use most often is going to be trans, and so that definition is an umbrella term derived from a contraction of transgender or transsexual. The prefix trans can be beyond, across, between, through, transcending, or changing. So many trans people have a gender identity that is different from the one they were assigned at birth. Some people identify as trans if their gender expression is different than what is expected for their gender. So that's the definition of trans. There's also cisgender or cis, and so that's a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex. So they identify themselves in the way that they were, identified at birth. So that's two different terms that you might hear us say throughout the conversation. Here are some of the other ones that these three are probably the ones that you're more familiar with, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and then of course heterosexual. But there's also a lot of other terms that kind of express people who don't necessarily fit into those like 4 different categories. So it's important to be knowledgeable about those terms and kind of educate yourself on those definitions as well. So now that we kind of have a base layer of understanding of what terms mean, and then also, what kind of population we're looking at, this is some of you may be surprised by how high those percentages are and how quickly it's growing too when you just look at the different age groups. So now that we kind of have that information, we'll talk about what or how that applies to us in this, student housing industry. So there's an article I found that says top 10 factors that LGBTQ youth look for in choosing a college campus. Now, of course, some of us on this call maybe do work in the, on-campus housing like our other panelists do. Some of you may be like me, where we work in off-campus housing, but I would imagine that the factors of someone choosing a college campus are going to be very similar to what would make someone choose off-campus housing. So these were the 10 factors. So active LGBTQ student organization, out LGBTQ students, out faculty and staff, LGBTQ inclusive policies, visible signs of pride, allies from the top down, inclusive housing and gender inclusive bathrooms, established LGBTQ center, LGBTQ and queer studies, and then progressive culture and vibrant LGBTQ social scene. So some of that is referencing directly to the college itself, and some of it's going to, of course, be a factor of the city in which the college is located. But some of those things are, for those of us that are a part of off-campus housing, are things that we can control, even if our city or our school doesn't necessarily have those things. Yes, we may not be able to change, if there's the option to major in queer studies or not, but we can take it upon ourselves to provide, guest lecturers or whatnot during different community events. So those are things that we can still provide as resources to our students, even though we're not necessarily always going to be affiliated with the college that is in our, the city where we're located. So one of the first questions that kind of comes to mind with all of this is when you are wanting to cater or be more inclusive in your community or in your college, is how do you go about, identifying these students? Is it something that should you even try to identify students? Should it just be, everybody, you don't designate one way or the other? Is this a conversation that you should have? Is it a conversation that you shouldn't have? One of our biggest frustrations in our side of the industry is that our technology kind of hasn't quite caught up with the world. And, when we're doing applications or roommate matching or whatnot, we don't have the ability to ask as many questions as we would like, or to be able to get as much information so that we're making positive and informed decisions on how we do place people. So I definitely want to get some information from our panelists here to kind of talk about how they handle it on the university level. So Elijah, if you could kind of speak on what you guys do as far as identifying your LGBTQ plus students and, when they're applying or when they're looking for housing on campus.
Yeah, I'd love to. So in some ways, we deal with some of the same constraints that an off-campus provider might, in the sense that a lot of times the information we're provided is just from admission. So we're just seeing legal sex that's provided, and we're not necessarily getting gender identity off the top. So what we end up doing is including in our application process, we include what we call five important questions, usually asking, do you have medical accommodations, things like that. But we also include a question that says, does your gender identity differ from the legal sex that's been provided by admissions? And that's kind of just like a little flag that we have to provide that student with additional options. So what it does is it sends them an email saying, hey, we have this form you can fill out so you can tell us more, or you can have a conversation with a staff member, usually myself or one of my coworkers, where we can have like a phone conversation or in-person conversation about what kind of accommodations they think they need or what kind of housing concerns they may have. Now, ultimately, if you have those kind of constraints, it will come down to a certain amount of legwork. There's not like a perfect way to do that if your system doesn't have that ability to take in additional information. I encourage, though, if you do have the opportunity to kind of tailor your applications and be able to pull that information from a more standardized application, to use a lot of open text fields. So rather than drop downs, rather than check boxes, you want to give a lot of space for folks to answer the question the way they would, because at no point are you going to be able to capture all of the identities that are going to show up. There's going to be things that kind of expand beyond just looking at men and women, trans men, trans women. You're going to see a lot of different identities. And the best way to get honest information about your students and the best way to serve them is to really just let them fill in a box. Because ultimately they're going to know what's best for them. When we get too prescriptivist is when we start running into issues. Generally, I think that identification should ultimately be left to the student. So when it comes to should they be identified at all, you can choose to kind of have a blanket process that tries to incorporate them without identification. But I would strongly encourage it always having at least a venue to which a student can have a conversation with you. So even if it's not included in the application, maybe you have a portion of your website that says, hey, we're aware that there are different needs for trans students or LGBTQ students for housing. Contact the staff member for more information, or if you have concerns you want to bring up. That's the best way I can really encourage folks to handle that.
Definitely.
And just to add to that, I'd say as well, if you are identifying students in person, kind of having that conversation way that's purposeful, but also like respectful. Because if there's not always a polite way to ask about gender identity in a way that respects that person's journey. So like Elijah was saying, I think open text is a really good option online, but you are going to have students who may be calling your complex to ask about their housing options and struggling to have that conversation of, if their parent's the guarantor, how are they telling you their gender identity based on that? Does their parent know? So being able to have that conversation in person too, and being able to tell them how their gender identity might be reflected in the options that you have available, I think is also really important to consider, because at the end of the day, it's all fine and good when you have those text options, but what you have online needs to be able to translate to your in-person.
Yeah, and additionally, if there's information that you're collecting that is identifying people who are going to live in your complexes that do identify as LGBTQ, being upfront with students and staff members or whoever's involved in that, where that information is going to stay. So if there is a student who identifies as another gender that's not the one assigned at birth or on their license and other legal information, that can be outing if there's forms that are going through a company or through a business or through a housing administration that don't align. And that might be something to be able to keep papers in-house and only do in-house processes, or even just have like open housing opportunities. So there's not strictly like men have to live with men and women have to live with women. That can help alleviate that stress of where the record's going, who's getting my information. I need to be myself, but do I have to be less of myself to make sure that I'm being safe? So there's ways to kind of monitor how you can collect that information and where you put it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So that's something that, I definitely don't want to say that, Landmark Properties is the expert or has everything right. This is something that's new for us as well, as we're kind of navigating the best ways to make our policies and our software and stuff kind of be more inclusive and be more open. So that's something that, we're really trying to instill in our properties, just being comfortable and having the conversation and being open to it. And I love the the comment that you made, Elijah, about even just adding that blurb on your application or on your website. Sometimes the applications don't give you as much flexibility, but maybe they'll have like a spot where you can add a blurb of text, or even putting it on the website where there is that like apply now button saying, if you have, additional concerns or something like that, please reach out, as our, application may not be, able to fulfill all of your needs as far as like the questions that are available on there, and just making sure that your staff is prepared to have those conversations and are trained in a way that they know what's kind of comfortable to say and what's not, and also understanding that not everybody's going to get it right, but as long as you kind of go about it with the right intention, then it's going to be an educational experience for both parties. So because a lot of times we're dealing with people who maybe haven't lived away from home at all, so this is their first experience kind of dealing with this as well. They're also potentially going to be rooming with people they don't know, so that's another experience for them that they haven't had before, especially if your property is in a location where the college doesn't require freshmen to live on site. Then we are definitely their first experience. But one thing to do is make sure you kind of communicate with the college that you're affiliated with so that you know how they handle the situation. So for us, we have several properties in Orlando, and so now we know how UCF, kind of what their process is. So how, freshmen are exposed to this process. So when they come to off-campus housing, they're going to kind of assume that the process is going to be somewhat similar. So that's another thing that's really important, is to reach out to those that are kind of tasked with this responsibility at the campus level, so that you're able to try to kind of at least somewhat mimic your policies, or at least have it where you're aware, so you can acknowledge it, and then say like, well, this is why it's different at this property than it was when you were living on campus. So the next question that we have is, is about roommate matching. I'm sorry. And now it's working really fast. So it was slow before. So about roommate matching, do you, on the campus level, do you guys match based on sex versus gender? How do you kind of handle that situation as far as driver's license? There's different talks in the community, whether it's best to segregate or integrate. So it's just kind of an interesting topics on and making sure, again, like understanding how your university or your college and your location is handling this topic, so that it does at least somewhat transition into off-campus housing. So Elijah, do you have some kind of intel on these questions or these topics?
Yeah, I do. Though I did want to touch on one thing that you brought up in the last one about how if you're dealing with freshman students, that this is their first time and this is going to be new for them. That's really important to remember also when you're having these conversations. Your students may not have the perfect language either. So it's okay to feel a little uncomfortable with that. And what I recommend is, if you both feel like you don't know exactly what words you should be using, is to really focus on what the outcomes that you want. So you don't necessarily have to break down, like, I need to understand this person's gender identity perfectly and like I need to know everything. You don't. Like, all you really need to know is how do I incorporate the student into my community? How do we provide them with housing accommodations? So kind of focusing on what do you want the end goal to look like in your conversations can kind of help diffuse some of that tension when you're kind of stumbling over words. And it's like, who do you want to live with? Which kind of brings us into roommate matching, in the sense that a lot of times what UCF is doing is we're asking the student, who do you want to live with? Like, what is your ideal scenario? If they don't identify to us, if they don't tell us, we have to use their admissions sex that's listed. That's just the default matching that we use. So unless they say something, that's what we lend to. If they do talk to us, we are more than happy to book them on the basis of gender or basis of safety and comfort level. So there's some students who want to be placed with other students of their gender identity, whether that's a cis person who happens to be a man as well, or other trans students. Some exclusively want to be placed with trans students, irrespective of gender identity. So we've had trans women live with trans men and they feel comfortable with that setup. Not everyone will. Some people still want that kind of like binary separation. They want to have that kind of traditional college experience. We acknowledge that and we work with it to the best of our ability. But ultimately, again, we use that, tell us if it's wrong, and then kind of give us a free form answer about what works best for you. The segregation integration thing, UCF doesn't designate specific areas that are exclusively for trans students or exclusively for cis students. We really just work with individual students on what works best for them. And that's kind of worked from that point forward. I'm really excited that we're actually switching to a new resident management system with StarRes, which has additional gender options for us. So we're going to be able to have male, female, neutral, and other. So I'm really excited to see how that can probably help automate some of these processes. So if maybe we can get students comfortable with 2 more options, maybe there's going to be a little less legwork on our end of just like hand booking these students, which isn't always possible if you're looking at larger communities. If you're managing multiple properties, it definitely can get kind of taxing, but that shouldn't be a reason to not do it.
Right.
My only thing.
I just wanted to touch back on what you were saying about segregation versus integration, because I think that's one thing that's a really important element, especially when you're going into off-campus housing. I know within the university that Elijah and Cody and I all work for, there are some, and Elijah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that we do have some LLCs that are more in segregation model, so we have living learning communities. But I think the issue, if you as a complex create like a segregated unit where you're like, this specific floor of our building is trans friendly, is it almost calls too much attention to how different those people may already feel. So I think integration is a much better model to go for, because the idea of housing, whether it's on campus or off campus, especially coming in as a student, having this experience away from home, having this experience sometimes away from a community, is feeling like you're part of something. So I think the most important thing is keeping things integrated where these residents and students can feel comfortable in that community and environment of living.
Definitely.
So.
Yeah, no, to answer that a little bit about the LLCs, we do at UCF have a social justice living learning community that includes the option for the apartments to be gender inclusive, which essentially means there is no gender requirement at all. So male, female, trans, cis, there's literally no check on it. It's just if you want to participate in this LLC, you can have any roommate within that LLC. I would advise against conflating the ideas of gender inclusive housing. So if you have, say you've got a building that you don't control who's living with who, and it's like male, female roommates are fine, that doesn't necessarily address the accommodations that trans students will need necessarily. More often what we see gender inclusive housing kind of lend itself to more often is honestly couples. We see that used more frequently by couples, by siblings, like twins, if they're fraternal twins and there's like a gender difference. Those are usually the folks who end up capitalizing on gender inclusive housing as a concept more often than we see our trans students do it. Not to say that we shouldn't move towards that. I'm all for gender inclusive housing going forward. I think it's a much better model, especially for occupancy management purposes, because Lord knows nobody likes 3 vacancies that you can't fill just because of a gender requirement. So I think it's a good process, but it shouldn't preclude thinking about what your trans policies are. And that'll get more important when you start having those difficult conversations with people who might have some animosity about the idea.
Right, definitely. And that's something too that, when we're kind of talking about the segregation versus integration concept, in my opinion, and whether you're at the university level or off-campus housing for students specifically, I would say that, whether you want to say it's our job or not our job, but we have a responsibility in preparing them for life after college and after this experience. And so that's something that, while I could understand some wanting to be, segregated to be able to, feel more comfortable or whatnot, I think it's a part of our responsibility, not just to prepare the LGBTQ community, but also everyone else, that they're starting to get exposed more to different types of people and different situations, so that they're not going to be, so sheltered when they go out into the real world and are faced, with that and have never had, any type of experience prior to, because everything was kept so separated and to try not to, ruffle people's feathers. I think we do need to ruffle people's feathers more. So thank you for, and then the next kind of question is about how this kind of works into residents' life and programming. So some of the questions are, what are some tips and tricks for offering programming to this community? Should it be advertised as LGBTQ plus friendly? Should your property advertise in that way? That was, one of the things that the slide earlier mentioned, is that people in that community are looking for more events and more activities that they, are going to be able to feel included in. And so that's something, our company requires different amounts of programming events each semester. But how is something that, how do you guys at the campus level create these events that are, whether geared towards or open to this community? So I'll kind of leave that to Mac and Cody.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I think with programming and offering it to the community, at least in residential communities, really building that foundation of inclusion at the forefront of your conversation. So whether that's on campus with residence hall directors, RAs, or off campus where it's community managers, and then you kind of just live on your own. Being upfront about, we want everybody to participate, and whether that's you get inclusivity trained on campus or at your housing administrations, and really have that as an open thing when people walk into the office, or you're having training specific for specific populations. So at least at UCF, we do in LGBTQ services, all of my programs are directed for the LGBTQ community. And I know not every university or housing administration has something like that, but whether it's programming for specific populations where, okay, we're going to do a movie night, but it's going to be a movie about, someone in the LGBTQ community, whatever demographic they may be, and you can talk about it, have an educational session, or even just a cookout, and you can bring your partner, and just really creating gender neutral language, inclusive language, talking about, if you're having an event, being able to introduce yourself with your pronouns, and kind of just build that foundation for inclusion. I think for the second point, having it advertised as LGBTQ friendly, I think that really depends on your property and your office. If you would want to make it, quoted as LGBTQ friendly or LGBTQ focused, because if it's going to be offered to one part of your property, it should be open to all of your property. So noting it as LGBTQ friendly kind of comes with having a housing kind of scenario and having that kind of setup for it being open for all of the population, or if it's geared to a specific population or demographic, whether that's LGBTQ for the purposes of this panel, or other social identities, if that's something that the community would like to see.
And just to piggyback on, I think one advantage a lot of the time that you will see with off-campus housing, is that they may have more opportunities for programming than on-campus housing options. I know currently in my role, I can't do any programming. So to see that off-campus communities are able to offer that is a huge benefit for the LGBTQ community. So I'd say in terms of programming, like a lot very similar to what Cody said, but you don't have to tack the words LGBTQ friendly onto an event to make it LGBTQ friendly. So for example, this week is Transgender Week of Visibility. So if the complex chose to have events that recognize transgender visibility, it could be as simple as like this pin is the trans flag. So it could be as simple as including those colors in advertising for a trans friendly event. It could be bringing in local speakers. It could be, I know, like, for example, Love, Simon is out right now, and that's not a trans movie, but it is about a gay love story. It could be as simple as partnering with a local movie theater to make that film accessible to your complex. So programming doesn't always have to be like rah LGBTQ. And honestly, if that got shoved in my face all the time, I'd be less inclined to go to that kind of programming. But it's kind of just about putting out there that those opportunities are available, and that it could be, like Cody said, as simple as a night where you can bring your partner. So it's a lot of it, I think, in programming is looking at the language of your programming and looking at the outreach of your programming, and being cognizant of events that are going on that might affect the community. So maybe looking at, Pride Month is coming up. What can we do to help recognize Pride Month? And the last point I would touch on is university partnerships are probably the most powerful tool that you can have in your belt for programming. It has made a huge difference in housing here to have those partnerships, to have those events available, because there's only so much you can do with your resources, but having a university behind you not only is going to help you resource-wise, but it helps your students feel connected in a way that sometimes on-campus housing might have an advantage of. So if you're able to reach out and keep those connections with the campus, you have more resources, you have more ability to really make things come full circle.
Mm-hmm. In addition to university partnerships, having partnerships with local inclusive organizations. I know at UCF and other Orlando-based and Florida-based institutions and organizations, we work with Equality Florida, and they have sensitivity training. They have ways to coach organizations on how to be inclusive and how to create that inclusion for their students. So, wherever your institution is, whatever state you're located in, city, whatever that looks like, being able to reach out to other local organizations that can create that partnership. And, if you're developing we've never had LGBTQ plus targeted programming, how do we do that? And you have local nonprofits, LGBTQ centers, being able to provide direction on, this is what the community looks like in your specific area. Here's trends that are happening there. Maybe do something like this. Because we don't expect perfection. And, it's difficult when that's something new that you want to develop and you want to be inclusive, but you're not sure how. Really developing those partnerships and asking those questions and having conversations like this is important, and getting those initiatives started or pinpointing initiatives that you're already doing and making them better.
Yeah, definitely. And to kind of piggyback off of that, for us, we have different categories of events that we require our sites reach every semester. And so some of those are philanthropic based. So even just sponsoring different, I know especially during Pride Week, there's all sorts of different events or things that you could sponsor, or even we also do social nights at different bars or restaurants, and mixing in a couple that are more, predominantly gay and clientele, or just kind of being smarter, or being about, like you said, you don't have to have it, smacked on the advertisement, but just being smarter about how you phrase things. I like the comment you made about bring your partner instead of saying, boyfriend or girlfriend or whatnot. There's different just different language that you can use in certain event flyers or event information that is going to be appreciated. And it doesn't always have to be in your face. And especially with the pins, that might be something that maybe you have your staff, everyone wears a pin, or you have them kind of available at the front desk. Maybe you do put, a logo or a pride flag or whatnot on the bottom of your website, or have it, displayed somewhere in the clubhouse. There's lots of different things that you can do that don't have to be, super in your face and bold, but just kind of making decisions when you're doing your programming that are going to, we all do it where we try to target certain groups. We're trying to target the Greek community, or maybe we're trying to target more of the, international student study groups and whatnot. So you go to different places to get those groups. It's kind of the same thing. And I'm not saying to use it as a advertisement, but we already kind of have that thought process. So it works the same way when you're trying to just be more inclusive to that group, as finding where, what types of events or what types of things are going on in the culture, like you mentioned the movie, that you can, participate in. So I think those are great kind of tips for all of us to utilize. So the next kind of topic was about sensitivity training. This is something that, I am over the training for our company, and I would not consider myself an expert on this topic. So I wouldn't, I need to be able to reach out and get more information from people who are experts. And so there's a lot of times that there are resources that a lot of people don't realize that are there and are usually free. So, that's something that's a really big thing that that Cody and Matt mentioned about Equality Florida. Different states are going to have different nonprofit groups that are going to be willing to kind of come in and help you with training or provide training, or even just partnering with your university if it has a program where, they might be willing to let you kind of join in on the training that they're giving to their staff, or at least kind of give you tips and tricks on what ways that they train. So with that being said, these are some of the things that you want to kind of discuss with your staff when you are giving them this training. What happens if an assigned roommate isn't comfortable with their LGBTQ plus roommate? What kind of staff training is recommended in that situation? How do you guys prepare your staff to kind of handle those situations? And then where do you kind of tell them to draw the line, or what kind of boundaries do you kind of suggest for them to have in that situation? So Mac and Cody for that question.
So with my staff, we actually do a lot of situation-based trainings. Specifically for the scenario, we have a situation every year where we discuss what happens if somebody's roommate comes out as gay, and how do we handle that if they're uncomfortable. But one thing that was brought up that's kind of changed my perspective on it when we did this session in person was sometimes it's not the roommate that has the issue, it's the roommate's parent. Mm-hmm. So I think the important thing to take into consideration is that we're confronting multiple perspectives on what it's like to live with somebody who's LGBTQ. That being said, I think it's really important to take the mantle of, like, if your complex is out there supporting and being inclusive of LGBTQ roommates and an issue arises, should a room switch have to happen, or should something have to happen, it should happen to the person who has the problem with the situation. Mm-hmm. And that being said, with staff training, I think it's about a lot about cultural competency. Everybody's coming from a different angle. So I really liked what you were saying, Emily, about university partnerships. I'm actually working with a complex right now to help give them safe zone training for their complex, so that they're able to have that cultural competency and have that recognition of how can we handle these situations. So we have a 101 training and an advocacy training as well. And that will kind of give them the groundwork. So I think, like, just having that basic staff training, but also more importantly, refreshing that training, because terminology will change, residency will change, and kind of just touching on staff boundaries too. I think the thing to note is, if you're on a staff and you're dealing with an issue like this, especially if you're a member of that community, it's really easy to get personally invested. So I think it's important to know in an intervention, are you coming at it from a personal angle, or are you coming at it from the perspective of the resident? And when is it appropriate to bring somebody else in versus when can you handle that situation yourself? And also recognizing that if your cultural competency isn't there yet, it's okay to ask somebody else for help in that situation. So if it isn't really your comfort level, deferring to somebody else. So
definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hitting on the staff training and resources piece, if there is a local campus, reaching out to, if there's not an LGBTQ center, most campuses don't have a center, but they may have an office. UCF is one of those institutions where we don't have an LGBTQ center, but LGBTQ services functions as that education piece with our safe zone trainings, which are just 4 different trainings on LGBTQ social competency. But a lot of campuses don't have that luxury, and whether it's a point person who has some kind of LGBTQ influence or experience, those resources may not be there. So using Campus Pride as a national resource, they provide a lot of, and it's just a website, you can type in Campus Pride. They have a lot of resources on what kind of safe zone trainings you can do, what policies, and they have a report card of inclusivity for most campuses throughout the country. Some do and don't participate, but the ones who do participate, you can kind of look at the things that are seen as inclusive and kind of see what universities are doing to check those boxes off, and kind of taking that list into your own organizations and housing complexes, and kind of talk about, okay, well, these are things that universities are doing. What can we do to create those environments as well? And then also utilizing the Human Rights Campaign. Most of them have state offices across the country, and a lot of local offices within those states as well. And then the national organization, they provide the same support that Campus Pride's doing, except more of like a policy national focus, but they still have the training focus, they still have the cultural competency piece, they still have the legislative piece, and ways to really take those and dissect them and apply them to whatever's applicable for your context with your housing organizations.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's definitely a great resource. I didn't know about that website, so I'll definitely be taking a look and kind of seeing how our different communities are within the universities that are partnering with, and kind of seeing which ones that are going to have more resources, so that I can make sure that we're doing as much as we can as far as partnering with the resources that's already there. It's already there. Don't feel like you have to try to go and educate yourself and learn everything on your own. There's so many different free resources out there that all it takes is just taking a little bit of initiative and reaching out and trying to and luckily this is people are going to be grateful. They're going to be excited that you are wanting to find out. So I think sometimes off-campus housing, they maybe don't want to go to the university. The university might not seem like they're going to be as helpful with off-campus housing, but I think this is a topic where you maybe won't see that, separation, because I think the universities are going to be in this department excited to provide that information, whereas it's not necessarily competing for residents, but it's making sure that we're giving our students, because whether they live with us or live on campus, they're our students, and giving them proper resources and providing that inclusivity is going to be a goal that everyone should have, and hopefully you won't meet any roadblocks in that situation. I can't imagine that you would, but if the university isn't available, then there's government resources as well, so don't feel like that's the only option. So that kind of wraps up our different topics that we had. Here are some websites that you can go to for more information. Also the one that Cody mentioned, definitely, that's a great one as well. And then we wanted to kind of leave some time for any questions that anybody, that's watching might have for us. So I'm going to kind of pass it to Clark to see if there's any questions coming in on y'all's end.
So if you're attending and you have a question, use the Q&A box that's on your control panel to zip off a question to us, and we'll see if we can't get a good answer for you.
I did have one point to kind of throw out there about when you're looking at if a roommate has a problem, or if you're dealing with a parent who has a problem, really look at your policies. What your written policies are is when you're looking at your agreement terms when you're writing them. You may not have that explicit control, but really review what your cancellation policies are, what your room change policies are, and ensure that you have language to back up the way that you want to actually enact these things. So if you want that text to explicitly say, hey, we don't do room switches just because you don't like XYZ about your roommate, we only do it in these particular cases, that can be a huge stepping stone in having those conversations, because it's not uncommon for a parent who feels like, well, I'm the guarantor, I'm the one who's paying, yada, yada, yada. Even if the student doesn't necessarily feel that way, they will feel a certain level of entitlement. So having that written policy will be very important to kind of back up what your staff can do.
Yeah, definitely.
And I would think that if your policy, those kinds of situations that you walk through might help to reshape or tighten up your policy statement. Because basically in the world of multifamily housing, it's basically a contractual agreement, and you're going to have to be able to redirect back to what the parameters are that are spelled out in the policy.
Sure. Yeah, our lease is written in a way as such as, we talk about how we don't, you're not guaranteed that you're going to get along with your roommate for whatever reason, and we can't guarantee you that we're going to be able to move you should some sort of issue arise. Because sometimes our properties are, obviously the goal is to be 100% leased, so there might not be a room to put them in, but we also have the opportunity where it's worded that we can transfer somebody at our discretion. So maybe it's the opposite side where a student is complaining about being harassed, or they're unhappy because of the way they're being treated. We could still force the other roommate. Again, we would never force the victim to move. It would always be the person at fault or the person with the issue. We can always, our lease gives us the right to force transfer somebody if we need to. I mean, of course, we don't enact that as often, but we do have those kind of wordings in there. And if you're doing any type of roommate matching, you definitely want to have some sort of language like that in your lease agreement, because even if it's not related to sexuality, there's going to be some conflict. It's natural with strangers living together, or even when people who knew each other their whole lives all of a sudden start living together, they're going to have some problems.
Indeed. It looks like we have shy attendees, so no one has a question.
Yeah.
Or maybe your conversation was so thorough that you managed to cover all the issues. I'm really pleased I had a chance to listen to the conversation again. I had heard part of it at the conference, and it's really interesting. You know, I'm going to sound mature when I say this, but these kinds of considerations were not taken when I was a university student, and to me, it's fascinating and complex and mature. So to close things out, I want to thank our fantastic and enlightened panelists for everything that you contributed to the conversation today. I was super impressed myself. This Encore learning opportunity represents just one offering in a lineup of 16 breakout sessions that focus on student housing at the conference. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted to our event website. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording so that you have access to all the information shared today, including the email addresses, the links to the resources that we showed earlier, and also be able to go back and review parts of the conversation. If you have questions, I'd encourage you to reach out to the panelists through the email. They have all agreed to be available to answer any questions that might come up after the event is over. And we're grateful to them for that. And other than that, we hope that you enjoyed your experience here today, and I think that it was a valuable conversation to take part in. Before we jump off, I just want to point out that NAA's Apartmentalize will be taking place in San Diego in June. The dates are June 13th through the 16th, and we expect more than 10,000 attendees of the multifamily housing industry. I always think of this as kind of like the meeting of the tribe. And I think that there's a lot of content in the education department that is applicable to anybody who focuses on multifamily housing, whether it be student housing focused or not. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Thank you all so much thanks to our attendees for dialing in. Thanks to our experts for being so gracious. So everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.